Racism is bad. I know, controversial. But even more controversial than that is the question, why is racism bad? And don't worry, this isn't me turning into Nick Fuentes. With this question, I am not trying to challenge the conclusion of whether or not racism is immoral. I'm just pointing out that when confronted with this question, not many of us are going to have an answer, and that should be concerning. After all, if you want to solve a problem, first you need to know what causes the problem. So I think if we accept that bigotry is wrong, which shouldn't be hard to do, and work our way backwards, we will actually find in this video an interesting critique of an ideology that you may not expect to be at the core of racism. Because imaginably most people will respond that bigotry is wrong because it is hateful, harmful, unjust, unequal, or otherwise unfair. And so we may be led to believe that there is no real grand conspiracy here where there is a philosophical ideology that leads to racist ideas. But again, while I'm not going to challenge these moral statements, racism is hateful, harmful, and unjust, I do think it's fair to point out that these statements are a bit circular. At the very least, they don't really answer the question in a meaningful way. Take, for example, the statement, racism is bad because it's unfair. The word bad implies some ethical framework, so what ethical framework are we talking about? Don't get me wrong, I'm no moral subjectivist. And I'm not even asking this because this is an instance in which we need to settle the matter of what it means for something to be good or bad objectively, because generally in most ethical frameworks, what is bad is harmful or hateful. But the issue I'm getting at here is that if we say racism is bad because it is unjust or unfair, then we are saying that it is bad because bad in whatever ethical system just means unjust or unfair. So we're essentially saying racism is bad because it's bad, which is why it doesn't answer the question. What does it mean for something to be bad? If something is bad because it is unfair, what does it mean for something to be unfair? It just raises more questions. Perhaps a statement like it's bad because it's harmful could offer up a more grounded premise in so much as harm and distress are physical responses. A dishonest person may ask us to prove that something being harmful makes it wrong, despite the fact that most honest people would concede that in one way or another, for one reason or another, harm is immoral, but even the most dishonest subjectivist would never ask us to prove that harm itself exists. So we can say that this is true and partially answers the question. Racism is bad because it is harmful and hateful, but is all harm and hate bad? Well, obviously no. Racists hate a person of a given race, but a person of that given race may also hate racists. Is that immoral? Even if you try to argue that it is because you believe that all hate is immoral, then surely you mean that all hate against people is immoral. As the saying goes, love the sinner, hate the sin. In addition to that, if this argument stems from Christianity, which it likely does, then you would also have to concede that when God is wrathful, this is not immoral. However you want to conceptualize it, just wrath, righteous anger, or hate, there is such a thing as good hate. Likewise, not all harm is bad. Obviously, with discrimination, we're talking about psychological and emotional harm, and so I imagine murderers who face life in prison probably feel some amount of emotional distress. Does this mean that we set them free? Yes, racism is hateful and harmful, and that's why it is wrong, but that is why it is wrong morally. That's only half of the puzzle. It doesn't speak to why it is wrong logically or ontologically, which isn't to say that there's a difference between morality and objective truth or objective reality. It's just that these are two sides of the same coin that have to work in tandem together. We can prescriptively claim that theft is bad, but in order for that claim to have meaning in this instance, we need to descriptively define theft. If I take something that is not mine and I was not given permission to take it from the owner, then that is theft. If I take something but I was given permission, then that is not theft. The nature of the act itself informs the morality of the action. And so, as we have conceded, there are groups that we can hate and cause harm to, and groups that we cannot. And the difference isn't really moral because we are not saying what we should and should not do. Since we already accept that we should do one thing for one group and another thing for another, we are simply asking why the nature of the groups differentiates them. And the answer to that should be obvious. If you were to take every phobic and ism you know and list them in order of what you think is the most real, your list would probably have racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism at the top. Things involving immutable characteristics. Whereas murderers murder, thieves commit theft, and racists say and do racist things. These are actions. Ultimately, what makes racism wrong is that we cannot discriminate on the basis of race because that is not something that someone has control over. It is not an action. It does not meaningfully reflect the character of the individual. Which, I know. At this point, you may be thinking, well, I already know that. But I'm not sure that the average person actually does. First of all, whether it's those who believe in freedom of religion or those who believe that anyone who questions groupthink gender ideology are transphobes, there seems to be this lingering notion that it is immoral to oppose an ideology. It is not, and it cannot be. And the idea that beliefs should have some special protections has no basis in logic. Ideas are not immutable. You choose what you believe. You can be held responsible for your beliefs, which we can fairly easily prove by virtue of the fact that I am currently expressing my own ideas. Ideas that you, if you disagree, think I should not hold and should not express. Now, you could argue that it is not your position that I cannot hold my beliefs and I can express them, but obviously you probably just mean legally or in some more restrictive sense of the term can. In other words, you think I'm allowed to, but that's not what I'm saying. If you seek to change my mind, then at least in me, you seek to eliminate my beliefs. You cannot say that you think I should have them, and you're clearly not indifferent to my beliefs, or else they would not provoke you. So it must be the case that you think I should not have my beliefs. So then it cannot be said that it is possible to discriminate on the basis of belief, because to say that this is possible is to discriminate against the idea that it is not. It is not discrimination to challenge ideas. Some ideas are good, but some ideas are bad. And obviously the metric of a good idea is whether it is true and whether it causes harm. Because the notion we have as a society today that ideas should have legal protection stems from two issues. One, who do we give power to in order to decide what is true and what is false? And two, even if we could give power to someone and not have it abused, is it really in society's best interest to persecute people for not having the right ideas? Isn't Western civilization built on democracy, built on compromise, the commerce of ideas where even bad ideas may have useful fruits, and the notion that liberty affords us a world where we don't have to be at each other's throats? After all, if we persecute the ignorant, maybe we'll make the world less ignorant, but when the ignorant fight back, we'll also have made the world more violent. So was it really worth it? These are interesting questions, ones that I'm not really going to try to answer here. But I guess what I'm just trying to say is that in both instances, we say that we should have legal protections for some ideas because we want to maintain freedom and avoid tyranny, or because we want to maintain peace and avoid war. In both, we are maintaining some social order. So it's so bizarre that we get caught up in this notion that we should be tolerant for tolerance sake and not for the sake of social order, and that we have this naive belief but then turn around and act as though we understand what is at the core of bigotry when we clearly don't. We think we do, but we just get caught up in this baseless and ridiculous narrative that is perpetuated by our culture. And just as baseless and ignorant of the true nature of discrimination, you have groups that consider themselves anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, or any other form of so-called anti-bigotry. You see, where first others fail to understand the true nature of discrimination because they refuse to accept belief as a choice in and of itself, which can reflect the character of the individual, these groups either intentionally or unintentionally collectivize the individual. This often leads to so-called reverse discrimination, because if groups are looked at as a cohesive collective rather than a collection of individuals, the actions of one individual against another are pinned on the groups as a whole. In this, members of one group are wrongfully blamed for simply being associated with the group. If black people in America face discrimination because of historical oppression, it isn't just the case that specific people wrong others and those people are at fault. It is systemic racism. It isn't the case that certain black Americans are underprivileged and discriminated against. It's that white people as a whole have white privilege. This all ultimately culminates in simplistic notions of oppressed versus oppressor, and viewing whatever social issue through the lens of conflict and power dynamics. So much so that many people would argue that something like racism isn't just the discrimination of a person based on race. They would wrongly argue that it is something that requires this narrative of power imbalance. But of course, this cannot be the case, as it always leads to contradiction. If power is the difference between the oppressed and the oppressor, then simply giving the oppressed power makes them the oppressor. And if oppression is wrong, then it is wrong to give power to oppressed groups. Here we have arrived at the conclusion that it is wrong to help the marginalized, oppressed, and underprivileged. A conclusion that is clearly wrong because of a false premise that leads to not just quote-unquote reverse discrimination, but discrimination of all groups. Which is why there's really no such thing as reverse discrimination, because this ideology is just built on explicit discrimination. If you say something like you can't be racist to white people or you can't be sexist to men, then not only only do you delegitimize discrimination towards one group, which is obviously wrong, but you simultaneously put your own group down. You are creating a power imbalance. You are saying this is how one group acts, but then the group you advocate for is quote-unquote other and is held to lower standards. Lower standards that create a discrimination of lower expectations and only perpetuates power imbalance, which unfortunately is just what many of these social advocacy groups want. We've become a society where victimhood is bought and sold like a commodity for some, and for others it's even worse. Other members of movements like these are legitimate supremacists, hiding their extremism and bigotry behind their victimhood. They understand that in a world of oppressed versus oppressor, their actions would make them the oppressor, but that's exactly what they want. In terms of economic classes seen through this conflict theorist view, Karl Marx once openly admitted in his critique of the Gotha program that a necessary step towards communism was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so it should be no real surprise that the aim of a lot of these movements is to overthrow established social order and install a supremacist culture that favors the in-group. After all, the father of conflict theory was Karl Marx. So to the dismay of anyone who never took a sociology course, yes, gender theory, feminist theory, and critical race theory are all derivatives of Marxism. So surely that's the ideology at the core of all forms of bigotry, right? Well, no. First of all, obviously I promised that it was an ideology that most people would not expect to be at the core of bigotry, and Marxism is an ideology that the right and moderates are constantly pointing out has a clear relationship with modern social movements. Not to mention then, of course, that this would only work for far-left forms of bigotry. No doubt Marxism has been co-opted either intentionally or unintentionally to work alongside the ideology that is at the core of discrimination to help mask it. But the true culprit of discrimination is empiricism, positivism, and more specifically in this case, determinism. Some people may deny what specific actions an individual can be held accountable for. Marxists may come along and ignore the individual in favor of a collective. But only determinists would deny the flaw in discrimination altogether by claiming that an individual is not capable of choosing actions. Because when you believe that all of our choices are predetermined either by our environment or by our genetics, it must necessarily be the case that people are not, in whatever part that they may be, the product of their choices. They are instead solely the product of their environment or the product of their culture. In this, just as those of us who believe in free will may see an animal like a jaguar, which we see as having less or no capability of making a free choice, and conclude that it is a dangerous animal because of its nature, a racist likewise comes along and deems certain races as inferior or even dangerous because of their genetics. After all, if we have no free will and we are the products of our genetics, then there must be something in our genetics that causes social deviance and criminality. Groups that share similar phenotypes are groups that share similar ancestry, and groups that share similar ancestry share similar DNA. This isn't just my armchair philosopher explanation of how racist ideology arises. This is the actual history of racism. Alongside positivist and empirical movements, there were movements like so-called scientific racism and the eugenics movement. Scientific racism believed that there was empirical evidence for the inferiority of some races. This is a mindset we see in quote-unquote race realists of today, where they will cite specific statistics in order to defame certain groups. But despite that, far too often and for far too long, the explanation given as to why discrimination exists is just, well, that group hates that other group, and that's it. But no, that's not just it. That's just a way of ignoring that we still accept the underlying premise of racism, which is why it is still prevalent to this day. It's all just an effort to ignore that the positivist and empiricist beliefs of scientific racism continue on and in fact thrive in modern schools of thought, where shallow-minded scientism is prevalent. Our society wants to forget its eugenics history because acknowledging it means calling into question prominent eugenicists like Margaret Sanger, one of the founders of Planned Parenthood. It means undermining the abortion movement. It means undermining far-left positions on mental health. It means undermining some of modern science because of how it was once tainted by positivism. But our society doesn't want to do that. Instead, for example, we just want to look at the Germans during World War II and blame their shortcomings on hate and fascism, even though Mein Kampf speaks favorably about American social movements, and even though Buck v. Bell was cited by German soldiers at the Nuremberg trials. Which, in case you didn't know, Buck v. Bell was a Supreme Court ruling which allowed for the forced sterilization of those society deemed unfit to reproduce. It wasn't until we as a nation were ideologically compelled by the tribalist notion that the Germans were our enemies and as such we had to hate what they believed that we finally conceded these things were wrong. But we never actually accepted why they were wrong. Instead, we just swept this dark part of our history under the rug and gave this pathetic excuse that many will still defend. It isn't just that racism is bad and it's just something that people believe in because they're hateful. It is because of positivist ideologies. Some determinists will argue that determinism is more complex than genetic or cultural factors, that it's this sort of complicated domino effect. So no, that doesn't mean that people of a certain biological or cultural group will act in a certain way. But first off, this asks us to believe that, for example, a butterfly flapping its wings in South America will have an equal or greater effect on the choices we make than growing up in a poor single-parent household. And secondly, but more importantly, it ignores the essence of the argument against discrimination. If you sat me down with a racist and told me that I had to convince him to not be a racist, my best argument would be this. Are you inferior because of your race? If you became a member of this other race, but you still had your memories, if you were biologically the race you hate, but still you, would you be inferior? Or is it the choices we make that make us who we are? If another human being is limited in his ability to act according to what he believes makes him a better person, then why are you, also a human being, not limited in your ability? I would appeal to the fact that people can choose who they want to be, so you cannot judge others based on immutable factors. Things that they do not choose. You can only judge them on things that they do choose. And so saying that free will does not exist means that this argument does not work. You can offer up the typical determinist excuse of, well, it could be this. It could be that it's more complicated than genetics or environment. But like I just said, that's just another determinist what if. It's just an excuse to ignore macroscopic cause and effect in favor of microscopic cause and effect in order to satiate your clear and undeniable bias. You know that it is very likely that if we do not make our own choices, that certain groups would be inferior to others because of factors beyond their control, because there would be no factors within their control. So at best, you have to concede that statements like racism is wrong become an unknown under this belief system. And of course, at worst and more likely, we would have to concede that positivist ideologies like determinism will always lead to bigotry. And that, alongside many other reasons that I've gone over in previous videos, is why they are wrong.